today we're going to really talk about how the gospel interacts in a culture that's really not that different, or how it interacted with a culture that's not all that different from the culture in which we live today. Specifically, some ideologies, religious philosophies, religious ideologies that were what made up the culture in which Paul is ministering here, and even some totalitarianism that we're not. I mean, there may be some that would argue we're starting to feel that, and that's for another day, arguing that, but certainly could come. And that's the kind of culture in which Paul is carrying the gospel for the first time into places that have never heard it before. So we're going to begin in Thessalonica, and if you have your map, you may want to grab that map, and you'll see up in the kind of the upper left-hand corner, not necessarily in the corner, about 2/3 of the way up along the left edge. This is the region that we're going to be talking about today, Thessalonica. Of course, Thessalonica is the city where the church that Paul wrote to in the book of 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. All right, that's the city of Thessalonica. People there in the church called Thessalonians. That's who Paul writes to. So we're looking again at Paul and Silas on their second missionary trip, chapter 17, verse 1. When they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. Then Paul, as his custom was, went into them, and for 3 Sabbaths he reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and demonstrating that the Christ had to suffer and rise again from the dead, and saying, "This Jesus whom I preach to you is the Christ." And some of them were persuaded, and a great multitude of devout Greeks, and not a few of the leading women, joined Paul and Silas. So Paul is going to experience initially some success in the synagogue. So let's kind of walk through these first 4 verses. So you look on your map and you go up beyond Thessalonica. You're going to see Berea, Apollonia, and you're going to see Amphipolis. So he starts off, and if you go a little bit further to the right, or to the east, kind of northeast, or to the right and up, you see Philippi. So that's where we left Paul last week. We remember the Philippian jailer, and they finally let him out, and they say, leave Philippi. So he leaves Philippi, and he travels, first of all, about 30 miles to Amphipolis. That's the first place that we read about here. That's the capital of what is, they were divided into districts. So the Amphipolis was the capital of the first district of Macedonia. He then, according to verse number 1, he travels another 20 miles to Apollonia. You can see that on your map as well, just really kind of almost due south. And then he travels 35 more miles to Thessalonica, which was actually the capital of the second, second and third district of Macedonia. So Thessalonica is about 62 miles west, kind of southwest of Philippi. Thessalonica is a crucial port city. It's there on the Gulf. It links sea to land routes throughout Macedonia. And so it's a really important city there, right along the edge of the Gulf. Now, his mode of teaching, he goes to the synagogue first. He always did that unless there wasn't a synagogue, like in Philippi. So he goes into Thessalonica. It means there is a prominent Jewish faction there because there's a synagogue. And he goes and he begins to teach. And his teaching is very logical. It's very deductive. Which is very much how Jesus taught as well. But he teaches about the Christ. Again, he's in the synagogue, all right? So he's teaching Jews that believe there is a Messiah that's coming. They've rejected Jesus, but these are people that do believe. They have the Jewish law. That's where he starts, because he always goes to the Jew first, Romans 1:16, and then to the Gentile. So he's in the synagogue, and really all he has to do is convince them that Christ is the Messiah they've been looking for. That's, with the Jews, that was all that really needed to be done, is teach them that Jesus is this Messiah that you've been looking for. And so in a very deductive way, he explains that Christ is their Messiah, and he explains that, in verse 3, that Christ had to suffer, die, and then rise again from the dead. And he says in verse 3, this Jesus whom I preach to you is the Christ. Where Christ is Christos, the anointed one, the Messiah. All right, so when he says he is the Christ to the Jews, Paul is saying he is your Messiah. All right, so he preaches that, and he reasons with them from the Old Testament scriptures. That's what verse 2 says. He reasoned with them from the scriptures. The word is graphe. It's speaking about the Old Testament. So he's explaining to them, very much like I would do, taking an Old Testament figure and like explaining how that when Abraham was going to kill Isaac, God said, I'll provide a ram, and how the Old Testament sacrifice pictured Christ. Those are the kind of things Paul would be doing, very deductive teaching in the synagogue, explaining to Jews that, hey, your Old Testament was pointing to Jesus, and he is your Messiah. So this is not rocket science here. Paul is just teaching that the Messiah you've been looking for is found in Jesus Christ. He's trying to overcome their really bad Jewish theology that the Messiah wasn't going to suffer. That was the real hang-up with the Jews. They could not bring themselves to believe that the one who was going to be their Savior, their Messiah, would suffer. They just, even though Isaiah 53 said, he's wounded for our transgressions and bruised for our iniquities, there was a disconnect in the Jewish mind that just could not believe. They thought the Messiah was going to ride into the city, he was going to be on a horse, and he was going to lead a military battle, and he was going to turn the Roman Empire over, and the Jews were going to reign. That's what they thought their Messiah was going to do, and he is eventually. But his first work was he was going to change people's hearts. They could not get that, and so with Jesus being crucified, he's checked off their list. He can't be the guy. So they ran a line through him. This obviously is not the Messiah because he suffered. And so Paul is trying to explain to them, no, the scriptures say he needed to suffer. So he is, with reasoning and deduction, trying to explain to them that their Messiah is Jesus and he did need to suffer. So Paul witnesses to some of the actual proofs of Christ's resurrection, and he has some success. In verse 4, it says that there are some converts, and among those converts there were a few Jews, there were many God-fearing Greeks. Remember, when we talk about God-fearers, we're talking about people like Cornelius, who was a Gentile, but believed in the God of the Jews, just didn't practice the law, but believed in Yahweh. And so there are some Jews that believe, there's many God-fearing Greeks that believe, and there were several prominent women in the community that also believed, and they joined with Paul and Silas. So this is his initial introduction into Thessalonica. Now, it's not all roses. We'll get to, yeah, John? Yeah.
There at the beginning there he said, and not a few prominent women. And then over here at Berea he said they had another prominent Greek women in Greek community. Is there any good discussion on why he would mention women?
Well,
Two different places.
the prominent would be they were people who were probably married to movers and shakers in the community, so they had influence. And so I think that would be the implication that's made there. I would just say it's not a secret that women were very active in the ministry of Jesus all along and crucial to to his ministry.
I've never seen that before.
Yeah,
The ones not, and over here, just the ones that were.
Yeah, well, and I think the word not means, when it says it's not a few, in other words, just another, it's a fancy way of saying quite a few. In other words, it wasn't just two, it was several. So I think in both places he's saying there's several women that joined. But I think the prominent part is the key there, and that's they were people of influence. So, all right, so it wasn't wasn't all easy. Verse 5, now we look into some of his opposition. But the Jews who were not persuaded, becoming envious, took some of the evil men from the marketplace, and they gathered a mob, and they set all the city in an uproar, and they attacked the house of Jason, and sought to bring them out to the people. When they didn't find them, they dragged Jason and some brethren to the rulers of the city, crying out, "Those who have turned the world upside down have come here too." Jason has harbored them, they thought, and these are all acting contrary to the decrees of Caesar, saying there is another king, his name is Jesus. And they troubled the crowd and the rulers of the city when they heard these things. So when they had taken security from Jason and the rest, they let them go. So the unbelieving Jews, keep in mind, before we give them too bad of a rap, the unbelieving Jews thought they were doing the right thing, which is the same thing that Saul had done. All right? Saul had killed Christians because he thought that was the right thing to do, to protect the honor of God. So these unbelieving Jews, they didn't buy into the fact that Christ is the Messiah. They take it on their own, or on their, they feel like it's their responsibility to protect their God, to protect Yahweh. And so they take measures to thwart this growing group of Christians, the prominent women, the Jews that didn't believe, the Greeks, and they decide they're going to cause an uproar and try to get this thing stopped. So they form a mob of rioters, and they set the city in turmoil. Sounds like last year, doesn't it? Here, or even this year. So there's this mob and this riot, and they attacked the house of Jason, because that's where they thought Paul and Silas were hanging out, and they thought they would get them out of there. Their hope was that they were going to put Paul and Silas on trial. In the day, that's what they thought. We'll put them on trial and we'll get rid of them that way. But they couldn't find them in the house of Jason. And so if you can't find them in the house of Jason, do the next best thing, get Jason, all right? So they dragged Jason out and some others, and they try to blame the mob, even though they had created it. Again, doesn't this sound like our world today, all right? They created the problem, but they tried to blame it on somebody else. They blamed the mob on Paul and Silas. Well, Paul and Silas didn't start the mob, but they tried to push the blame on them, and so they blamed this uproar on Paul and Silas. And verse 7 and 8, notice their charges. Jason has harbored them. They are acting, number one, contrary to Rome, the decrees of Caesar, because they're saying there's another king named Jesus. And they troubled the crowd and the rulers of the city when they heard these things. So they are blaming the mob on Paul and Silas. They are saying that Paul and Silas have rebelled against Rome, and so they try to stir up the crowd even further and pass the blame. Now, a little quick side notes in your notes, but when you read 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, and the reason it's kind of interesting here is because they were really, there was something apparently in the teaching of Paul, even though we're only given a snippet of it, but apparently Paul emphasized the kingly role of Christ as returning someday. Because that's their big issue. They say, well, they're saying there's another king other than Caesar. And the reason that's interesting is if you read 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, unlike, I don't want to say unlike, but more than any of the other churches, Corinth or Philippi or Galatia, more than any of the other churches, the church at Thessalonica really expected Christ to come back any moment. There was as a matter of fact, 1 Thessalonians, Paul has to write because they think Christ has already returned. They think he's already enlisted. And that's why they're struggling. What have we done? So Paul has to tell them, No, he hasn't returned yet. I say all that to say, in Thessalonica, for whatever reason, they grabbed a hold of this teaching of the returning king. Maybe that was Paul's emphasis, because that becomes the charge that they throw at Paul and Silas, is they're declaring there's another king other than Caesar, right? That's just a little way to kind of tie what's going on in Acts to what comes up in the letters later. So Jason and others, they can't find Paul or Silas. And so they let Jason and the others on in bond. But Paul and Silas are going to have to leave town, because obviously there's a warrant out for their arrest. And so they are going to skip town. The Jews had caused all the ruckus. But I do want you to remember that the gospel will always bring an unsettling to evil. All right? When there is godlessness, when the gospel and truth is really proclaimed, don't expect evil just to embrace it and say, this is wonderful, and let's all sing kumbaya, because it won't happen. There will be a resistance against truth, and that's exactly what happens at Thessalonica. Gospel is proclaimed, and the gospel is resisted. And we should just prepare ourselves for that. Jesus said, if they hated me, they're going to hate you. And so, now, Peter says, don't go out and try to make them hate you. Don't do something that they can hate you for that has nothing to do with the gospel. But if they hate you for truth, don't be offended by that. Just rejoice that you are considered worthy to feel and experience the same thing Jesus did. All right? So that's what happens in Thessalonica. All right, any questions or comments there? We'll keep moving, but this is a good breaking point if you have any comments there about Thessalonica. Anybody? All right, so we'll move on to Berea, verse 10. So again, you can look at your maps and notice that Thessalonica, which is, if you have to follow the line to where it's at, it's right out there on that little cutout into the Aegean Sea. Berea's back inland a little bit, so now they're going to move to Berea. Verse number 10. Then the brethren immediately sent Paul and Silas away. They got to get them out of town. By night, by the way, all right, they're traveling by night. When they arrived, they went into the synagogue of the Jews. Again, same thing they always do. These were more fair-minded than those in Thessalonica. In that they received the word with all readiness, and they searched the scriptures daily to find out whether these things were so. Therefore, many of them believed, and also not a few of the Greeks, to John's point, prominent women as well as men. But when the Jews from Thessalonica learned that the word of God was preached by Paul at Berea, they came there also and stirred up the crowds. And immediately the brethren sent Paul away to go to the sea, but both Silas and Timothy remained there. So those who conducted Paul brought him to Athens, and receiving a command for Silas and Timothy to come to him with all speed, they departed. So let's talk about Paul and Silas now in Berea. So with Timothy, they travel by night to Berea. Again, when they arrive, they go to the synagogue. And the Bereans, the text says they were more fair-minded people. It's a tough Greek word to pronounce, but I've kind of transliterated it for you here. Fair-minded is eugenus eugenami. Say that 4 or 5 times, and you will hurt, all right? But it literally means people of noble character, people of noble mind. They had qualities that were reasonable. Don't like to be around people that are reasonable, patient, open-minded as they sought the truth. They were not, there's some people that won't even listen to you when you tell them about Jesus. They just shut you off. They just know it's wrong even though they have no clue what you're going to say. Not the Bereans. Their demeanor was different. They weren't jumping on the bandwagon, but they were saying, we want to hear truth. And so they were more open-minded. And their mind is, there are some people that their mind's made up and you can't reason with them, not the Bereans. They were eager. But notice, they weren't naive. They listened to Paul, they were eager to learn, and then they went and they opened the scriptures up to see if what Paul had said was true. All right? That's one of the things, if you've ever did sit in my dad's Sunday school class, I remember him saying many times, you don't have to agree with me, that's fine. If it gets you to go home and open up the Bible, it's worth it, you know. And so that's what was happening in Korea. They were listening, they're open-minded, and then they're not just going to buy everything that Paul and Silas said without checking it. They go back and they check it out. I hope that the congregation of Glad Tidings is like the Bereans. Don't buy everything that I say from the pulpit because I said it. Check it out, study it, and make sure, because otherwise you won't hold on to it when things get difficult. If it becomes yours and you own it and you believe it, then you can stand when things are difficult. But if you just buy what somebody tells you from the pulpit and you don't really know why, and then a trial comes, you're easily shaken. The Bereans really sought out truth. And once again, many believed, including many prominent Greek women. And I missed that one point. I think it's interesting. Paul never has to write a letter to the church of Berea correcting them. All right? He never has to correct. He does Philippi a little bit, Ephesians a little bit, and then later Jesus will say to the church at Ephesus, you've lost your first love. Corinthians, he reads. Galatia, how quickly have you started with the Spirit and now you're trying to be made perfect by the flesh. But the Bereans, he never has to send a letter rebuking it. And maybe it is because they owned the truth. They didn't just take it and say, okay, we'll run with it. They dug in. It became what anchored them, and so they stayed solid. Again, that's a great reminder for why discipleship is so important. The Berean church did not need to be corrected later. So, but Thessalonians are hacked off because Paul and Silas have moved on to the next community, and so they go there and they stir up trouble as well. Just a little note here. The reality is that faith oftentimes precedes understanding. In fact, I would argue it always precedes full understanding. Maybe we should say it that way. In other words, many people, probably most of us in this room, came to Christ in a moment that we felt the Spirit of God calling us. We were convicted and we gave our lives to Him, not fully understanding everything yet. So a crisis moment of faith many times precedes a fuller understanding. And that's all right. That could be a hang-up for some, not for the Bereans. They continue to try to grow and deepen their understanding. Now, in a postmodern world in which we live, it can also happen. I don't want to get off too far on this, but there needs to be some patience on the part of mature Christians in a church who have known Jesus for a long time and who have studied the Word and kind of know what this is about and know what God is trying to do in our lives. We need to be patient with a postmodern world that doesn't have, they've been taught there is no absolute truth. They may have an encounter with Jesus. They may place their faith in Christ as their Savior, but they don't yet know the body of truth that hopefully we know. And so they may not, you see, let me just give you an example. A baby is not born chewing steak and working out on the treadmill and working a job. They're just not. They come out and you gotta feed them. Now, is that any less a life on day one than someone who is 32 and eating steak and working out on a treadmill? It's still life, spiritual life, but it's not yet grown into that which can do everything else. And so we really, and this is more true today, new converts may come in having a mind filled with postmodernism that says there's no truth, but they may have a crisis encounter with Jesus and accept Him by faith. We got to be patient as they almost have to be reprogrammed. And that's not unscriptural. Romans 12 says, be not conformed to this world, but be transformed or reprogrammed by the renewing of your mind. All right? And so, see, here, these people are Greek. They don't have any understanding of biblical truth, except the Jews that were saved. They did, but the Greeks didn't. They had paganism, all of it, so they're going to have to slowly grow into the depth of truth. Does that make sense to everybody? So I think we just need to expect that. All right, so Thessalonians come, try to stir up trouble. And once again, there'll be the second straight withdrawal from Silas, from Paul and Silas, from Paul. Silas and Timothy will actually stay to nurture the church, but Paul will make his way to Athens, which is the very heart of the Greco-Roman culture and the very heart of the Greek religion. And Paul's ministry is, I put it in the notes, it's like wildfire. This thing is going, and it reaches people in Thessalonica, it reaches people in Berea, and there's not going to be any stopping. They can bring down people to try to cause riots, but it's not going to stop the spread of the gospel because God is working through Paul. So, the people of Berea assist, and they accompany Paul to Athens to protect and to provide for him. And now we get Paul in Athens. So again, if you want to look at your map, and you will see that Paul has traveled from Philippi, Amphipolis, Apollonia, Thessalonica, Berea, and now he's going to travel all the way down here to Athens, and that's where we're going to be the rest of the time this morning. Any comments so far? Yeah, John?
Since the Greeks were in the synagogue, what was the relationship there? You said they went in the synagogue, so these Greeks are not...
The Greeks in the synagogue,
Are
right?
they Jews?
No, they're God-fearers, like Cornelius. Yeah.
Okay.
They have bought into one God, Yahweh, not keeping the law. Cornelius didn't keep the law, they weren't circumcised, but people like Cornelius that are devout, are praying to one God.
And they're searching.
Yeah, they're searching, and they don't have the Old Testament background at all. They just believe in this Old Testament God. So, all right, any other comments or questions? All right, so let's take a look at, spend the rest of the time here in Athens. So, just a little note here, the philosophies of, and I don't want to alarm you, but it's true, we are in a post-Christian America, all right? Again, I don't want to alarm you, we just are. This is not Christian America any longer. It is post-Christian. That's why we don't teach it in the school. We are a secular nation, not as bad as some European nations. We're not nearly that far gone, but we are not predominantly we are predominantly a post-Christian nation, and the whole West is. We're thankfully closer than Europe and places like that, but we join them in a generally post-Christian era. Because of that, secular humanism and its bend on scientific empiricism, in other words, I can't absolutely prove it, then which is really kind of funny because they can't absolutely prove a lot of things, but that's where they think they are. And then New Age pantheism, which just believes, gods and everything, and there's some of the strangest ideologies in America today where people find God all kinds of places. The thoughts of Post-Modernism, which is just simply there's no absolute truth. All of these things are very similar to what Paul's going to encounter when he gets to Athens. And really, his speech becomes a model for us how to deal with people in that mindset. So let's go to verse 16. And we may take this a little bit slower. So while Paul waited for them in Athens, he's waiting on Timothy and Silas, his spirit was provoked within him when he saw the city was given over to idols. Now, Athens was a city of less than 10,000 people. It was driven to poverty by its war with Rome in 146 BC. It was not a huge city at that point. It was given free status because Athens had an illustrious career or history. And so Rome gave it freedom, all right? Its best days were past, but it still had amazing architecture. It was the center of art, the center of religious studies. It was very eclectic. That is, it had lots of different kinds of beliefs and ideologies in it. Paul walks in to the city of Athens, and this is an important point for me. His spirit was provoked when he saw all the idols. That word literally means he became angry in spirit. We could use a little bit of that in our world today from Christians. Now, he did not act angrily. There's a difference. He didn't spew out anger. I hate to use this word when I just talked about Post-Modernism and New Age, but so he channeled that. I don't mean in a spiritual way, but he channeled that anger into a positive message. That's where we often fail. When we either don't get angry and we're just praise for us or all everybody want to do. It's fine. Or we get angry and we hit Facebook and we tick everybody off, right? So we need to find a happy balance, all right? Our spirit needs to be provoked by a godless world. If it doesn't bother you that you look around and thousands of people that you're running into are going to hell, and they're following false, if that doesn't bother you, something's wrong. Your spirit ought to be provoked by that. And I even have to watch myself sometimes. I try to enjoy life, and I want to have fun, and I want to laugh, and I do. But there's sometimes I just want to say, folks, this is serious. I mean, people are going to hell. It's happening all around us. Now, I don't think we're supposed to walk around all sad either. The Bible says to rejoice. So again, we have to find a balance. But I'm bothered by Christians that seem completely oblivious to the fact that friends and neighbors and schools and politicians and people we run into. I remember, seriously, as a teenager, going to Riverfront Stadium, and I was just 16 or 17, and I remember looking around and thinking, oh my gosh, I bet most of these people are going to hell. You know, and I was a 16 or 17-year-old, so maybe that just got burned in me young. But I kind of relate to that provocation of spirit that says this is serious. Paul walks in, and his spirit is provoked. There's evil here, and Christ is not reigning. So that's important. So, verse number 17. Let me find my place again. Okay, verse 17. Therefore he reasoned, excuse me, in the synagogue with the Jews and with the Gentile worshippers, and in the marketplace daily with those who happened to be there. Then certain Epicurean and Stoic philosophers encountered him, and some said, what does this babbler want to say? Others said he seems to be a proclaimer of foreign gods because he preached to them Jesus and the resurrection. And they took him and they brought him to the Areopagus, saying, may we know what this new doctrine is of which you speak, for you are bringing some strange things to our ears. Therefore we want to know what these things mean. For all the Athenians and the foreigners who were there spent their time in nothing else but either to tell or to hear some new thing. So he comes into Athens, his spirit is provoked, he reasons with the Jews in the synagogues and others in the synagogues, but he also reasons in the marketplace, all right? If you look in verse number 17, daily he reasons with people that just happen to be there. This would be like reasoning with people in the coffee shop, at the market. He's intermingling with people in the community, and he's reasoning with them at the park or at the mall. Wherever people were, Paul was there, meeting with them, reasoning with them, the same kind of reasoning that he had done in Thessalonica, because he speaks to them of the death and the resurrection of Jesus. So he's trying to tell them, with they have no earthly clue, he's trying to tell them about this Messiah. Now, among those that are listed are the Epicureans. The Epicureans follow the teaching of Epicurus, and what he taught was a radical materialism. That is, just live up life because there is no afterlife. Life's just a chance. So it happens to fall your way, good things, just live it up, enjoy it, because you just are one of those lucky ones that it happened to fall to your lot. So really enjoy life. That was the philosophy, the ideology of the Epicureans. They would laugh at the idea of resurrection because they didn't believe in the afterlife at all. Then there were the Stoics who followed the teaching of Zeno in 300 BC that said, just align yourself with reality and then don't stress anything else. You can't affect it. You can't change it. Your reality is your reality. You don't just deal with it. Life's cyclical. Just get a big circle of life. Just repeats itself. You have no control over it. So kind of jump into the circle and just ride life and don't try to change it because you can't. You are without control. So they are the big teachers there. The Epicureans, the Stoics, those were kind of the big ideologies. Remember, we're talking about philosophy was big. The Plato, the Aristotle, everybody is sitting, they would sit all day long. They had nothing to do but to sit all day long and talk about this stuff. And so Paul was right there in there with them talking about, but Paul's not talking about can't control it, not talking about chance. Paul's talking about a historical fact. Let me just, I think it was this week that I tweeted about this, but in my little devotion. But our faith is not built on, I feel pretty good today, or life's pretty good to me, and gosh, I had a nice hand dealt to me, or I had a bad hand dealt to me. Our faith's not built on that. We're not Stoics. Our faith is built on a historical fact that Jesus lived, born of a virgin, died in our place, was buried, resurrected, is seated at the Father's right hand, and is coming back. That's all historical fact. So our faith is not built on how you feel today. It's not built on, well, was it a good day or a bad day? And well, it's just the circle of life, and whatever happens, happens. Our faith is built on something that happens. So Paul, in the midst of all this wishy-washy philosophy, this is what Paul was talking about when he said to Timothy, people are always learning, but never able to come to the knowledge of truth. I mean, that's what, again, I hate to bust on poor Oprah, she doesn't even know me, but you watch Oprah, and everybody she brings on is just kind of like, well, how do you feel? What do you think? It's all these silly ideologies about what's best for you and what you feel. That's not Christianity. Christianity is based and rooted in truth. Absolute truth that guides our lives. We know how to respond to truth. It's hard to know how to respond to just wishy-washy feelings. We got truth. That's why the whole series of I Love Thy Law. We've got parameters. We're not just feeling this thing out. We're living based on truth. So Paul comes in the mix of all that wishy-washy philosophy, warm and fuzzy, your truth is maybe not my truth, but if you like it, that's good. And Paul says, no, there's truth. It's Jesus, he died, and he resurrected, and he's coming back. So he really messes. And so they say, okay, well, this is new to our ears. And so they bring him before the Areopagus. This is like the chief legislative council in Athens. And because, this is true, because philosophers were so big in the day, somebody come in with a new philosophy, this is what I think happens, and they would come in, but to get licensed to teach their philosophy in the community, they would have to go before the Areopagus to tell them whether or not they could continue to teach. So Paul's bringing in this new teaching, and so they bring him before the Areopagus to see if this new God was good for their state or not. Again, these people are always learning, 2 Timothy 3:7, never able to come to the knowledge of truth. That is like the world in 2021. And we want everything but the truth. I mean, we'll bounce around. Every ideology is accepted and embraced except historical Christianity. That's the one we push out. The only one that really locks in and sinks down and says, this is it, that's the one that gets rejected. Because everybody would rather find their own way. So they put him before the Areopagus, and so he gets to speak. Verse 22. So Paul stood in the midst of the Areopagus. And I'm just thinking Paul is chomping at the bit. I'm so glad I got this chance. I'm glad you asked me to tell you what I believe, because now I get a bigger audience and I get to tell you all. In verse 22, Paul said, standing before the Areopagus, and he said, Men of Athens, I perceive that in all things you are very religious. He starts off sort of kind of stroking them, all right? For as I was passing through and considering the objects of your worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God. Therefore, the one whom you worship without knowing, I will proclaim to you. This is absolute, it's spirit anointed, but I want to give Paul a little credit. It's also brilliant, okay? This is spirit anointed brilliance. He knows you are very religious. It would be like we would say there's a church on every corner, all right? You ever driven through a little small town that, on all four corners of an intersection, there's a little church? Wow, this must be a religious community. Well, in every corner in Athens, there was another idol. All right, there's idols everywhere, temples everywhere. And Paul said, you know what, I'm glad you let me have a chance to speak. First of all, I'm new to town, Paul said, and I have observed from my short little stint here in Athens that you are a very religious people. You obviously take your religion seriously. He's not really acknowledging that their religiosity, he's not acknowledging that their religiosity leads to saving faith. He's just saying, you all, we've got a lot of superstitions here and a lot of religions going on. He acknowledges, however, that they clearly are still looking. Because he said, I happened to notice while I was walking through town, that you got this one idol over there, and you even have an inscription that says, to the unknown God, which was his chance. He said, you're very religious, you've got lots of gods, but I noticed one that you gave a name, and it's the unknown God. In other words, you are apparently trying to worship one God that you don't even know yet. And so he said, I think what I'll do is, I'm almost hearing as a speaker say, I think I will limit my thoughts to talking about the one God that you don't know. I am here today to proclaim to you the one God that you have not yet found. Because they admitted, even if it was unconsciously, their ignorance. So Paul says, you open the door and I am walking through that door. Let me tell you about the God you don't know. And he begins to tell them in verse 24, God, who made the world and everything in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands. Nor is he worshipped with men's hands as though he needed anything, since he gives to all life, breath, and all things. And he has made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on all the face of the earth, and has determined their pre-appointed times and boundaries of their dwellings, so that they should seek the Lord in the hope that they might grope for him and find him, though he's not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, as also some of your own poets have said. For we are also his offspring. Therefore, since we are the offspring of God, we ought not to think that the divine nature is like gold, or silver, or stone, something shaped by art in man's devising. This is really a brilliant sermon. First of all, in verse 24, the God that I'm proclaiming to you today, Paul said, you can't hold him in a temple. You got lots of them. The God I'm telling you about, you can't put him in a little box. He's bigger. Verse 25, neither does he need to be served. You think you're all big because you're serving him? He doesn't need to be served. He's self-sufficient. You don't have to polish our God so he stays bright and full of luster. You don't have to patch him up when somebody drops a pan on him and he has a little shake. You don't serve this, not this God. Our God's self-sufficient. The God I'm proclaiming to you, he doesn't need your help. In fact, you couldn't contain him in the temple, and this God that I'm telling you about is not one that needs fixed by you. Not only, verses 26, 27, and 28, not only does he not need us, he's the one who made all of us. He doesn't need us. He gives you breath. You're breathing today. Paul said it to him. I mean, you got all these other gods, and you had to build a temple for them, and you had to make their statue, and then you had to polish it, then you had to fire it, and then if it gets nicked, you got to fix it. Not this God I'm proclaiming. The God I'm proclaiming to you, you can't. He doesn't need you. He doesn't need you to fix him. You can't contain him because he's the one that made you. He's just totally turned this thing upside down. And he not only made you, he gives you breath. Now he's talking to these Stoics and Epicureans. Paul is bringing good news to those who had lived under the bondage of an impersonal God. And he says, I'm proclaiming to you a God that's very personal. He's the one that makes you breathe. He is your breath. Now, again, modern humanity, we've got the Big Bang Theory, everything's by chance, natural selection. It is all blown up by a God that has made all. He's created it all. And so he is more than karma. He's more than just chance. He's a personal and a gracious God. There's lots of things that he says here, and I wish I had time to unpack them all, but I don't. But he does say in this speech that God's design in the very beginning was to create various cultures, to form a diverse patchwork, not so we would be separated, not so that we would be racist or we would hate other people. His design was to create various cultures to form a diverse patchwork across the globe. Verse 25 and 26, verse 26, he's made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on all the face of the earth, and is determined their pre-appointed times and boundaries of their dwellings. I put some scriptures there. I was going to take time to read them, but I won't. But really all of them have the same gist to them. God said in Genesis 1:28, be fruitful and multiply. He says that again to Noah in Genesis chapter 9. In chapter 10, God sends people in Genesis 10, he sends them to different areas. And I will have you read, look at Deuteronomy 32 real quickly. Deuteronomy 32 and verse number 8. Deuteronomy 32 and verse number 8. 32:8. When the Most High divided their inheritance to the nations, when he separated the sons of Adam, he set the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the children of Israel. That's just the design of God, is to fill the earth with a patchwork of those who will know him. And that was his ultimate plan. His design was also, if you go back to Acts 17, he sent them all over the earth, this patchwork of diversity, with the design in verse 27, so that they would seek the Lord in the hope that they might grope for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. So his design was that all of humanity spread out over all the earth would seek for him. What turned it into groping, and the word groping here is not like groping a person, it's like stabbing in the dark. What turned it into groping was sin. Our minds were blinded by the God of this world, and so now that's why there's all these different ideologies. That's why there's all these different philosophies. That's why everybody's grabbing for something. That was God's design, but sin made it difficult to find him. He's not far from us. That's what Paul says. He's not far from you. That desire that you have to have a God, God put in you, that's what he's telling them. He's not that far from us, but we're all groping because of sin. We're still morally culpable. Because it is his presence. Paul said it's not that you're off the hook just because it's hard to find him. It's really not that hard to find him. He's not that far from you. You're still morally culpable because his presence is what sustains us. And we are his offspring, so therefore we are responsible. God is the Father of humankind. We're not simply a complex compiling of DNA and electrical impulses. We are in his image. That's what Paul is saying. If God is alive, now think about this. Let's put the whole sermon together. You can't put him in a temple. You can't contain him. You can't serve him. He made you, and he breathed into you. In other words, he is picturing this God that is alive. He's a person. He's a personality. He gives life. He creates. That's not the kind of God they had. They had a God that they shaped and they put. So this God that I proclaim, the unknown God, Paul says, is a personality. He has feelings. He does things. And if he made you, now notice what he says, if he is the one that made you and we are all in his image, look at you. Like Paul's saying, look at you. You're not like that. You're not like that idol in that temple that has never gone to the grocery store because he can't move. You're not like that. You move around. You have life. Why do you move? Why do you talk? Why do you experience emotions and joy? Why is that? Because you weren't made by that idol that can't move. You're made in the image of a God who's alive. You see the difference there? He's explaining to them, let me make it real simple. Why in the world, he's saying, are you serving? When you are people that move around, have life, have feelings, have joy, you're happy one day, you're excited, you have victories, why in the world would you serve that bump on a log in that temple that can't even move? You see what he's saying? Why in the world would you do that? Because you're something different than that. So he's explaining to them that the reason you're that way is because the God that you don't know yet is that way. He's breathed life in you, and you can find him. Then he calls for radical change in verse 30. Truly, these times of ignorance God overlooked, and now he commands all men everywhere to repent, because he's appointed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by the man whom he has ordained. He has given assurance of this to all by raising him from the dead. So Paul says past generations from creation to Christ, with the exception really of Noah's generation that God destroyed, God kind of overlooked their sinfulness, didn't excuse it, didn't fail to notice it, but he did not ultimately punish it yet, because Jesus would be taking that punishment for us. It was deserved. You can see that in Romans 3:25. But now Paul says those days of ignorance are over because you just heard the message. That's what Paul's saying. You can't claim ignorance anymore. I just told you that. And he expects us all to repent, and people everywhere to repent and to turn from their idolatry and to worship God. See, prior to this time, humanity lived in sinful ignorance that God in his mercy had overlooked, but now sin has been judged by the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The day of salvation is here. And you must know Christ and his saving work. And Paul says, so repent, for final judgment is coming. Verse 32, and we'll wrap this up, and then you may have comments and questions. So when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked. The Epicureans would mock. They didn't believe in that at all. Some mocked, while others said, we want to hear more about this. We want to hear more on this matter. So Paul departed from them. However, verse 34, some men joined him and believed, and among them was Dionysius, I can't pronounce that, struggling today. Dionysius, who was the Areopagite. I was geared up to pronounce Areopagite, and I struggled. One of the believers was part of the council that listened to him. It means she was part of the Areopagites. And so one of the believers, one of the converts that day, was one of those who was commissioned to decide whether or not he could teach his philosophy exactly or not. So he won her, and she became one of the followers of Jesus as well. And it was a woman, named Damaris, and others with them as well. So some mocked, probably the Epicureans, some want to hear more, maybe the Stoics. Some decided to be followers and express saving faith in Jesus. And actually, it's interesting because Eusebius, who was one of the church fathers, actually says that this convert from the Areopagus actually became the first bishop of the church in Athens. So that's tradition. Whether that really happened or not, we're not certain, but it's an interesting